welcome back. In this episode we're discussing the innovator's dilemma, when new technologies cause great firms to fail, first published in 1997. This is the best-known work of the Harvard professor and businessman Clayton Christensen. It expands on the concept of disruptive technologies, a term he coined in a 1995 article, Disruptive Technologies Catching the Wave. Well-managed companies can fail precisely because they are well-managed. Christensen highlights this paradox throughout the book, demonstrating how a company's strengths in serving its core customers and efficiently allocating resources based on established metrics can actually hinder its ability to recognize and respond to disruptive technologies. Focus on existing customers' pursuit of higher margins, efficiency and consistency, and well-developed resource allocation processes, all essential for well-managed companies to drive profitability and growth. Christensen argues that this combination of factors creates a situation where the very practices that have driven success in established markets make it difficult for companies to recognize, invest in, and successfully commercialize disruptive technologies. Essentially, well-managed companies are doing the right thing according to the rules of their existing value network, but those rules become a recipe for failure when confronted with disruptive change. So, let's dive into today's podcast. As always, please share, like, and subscribe.
Welcome, everyone. Today we're diving deep into The Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen. It's a book that, grapples with this puzzling question. Why do successful companies, with all their resources, sometimes stumble when new technologies emerge? It's almost like they do everything right, but still end up, behind. Christensen makes this compelling argument that it's not about a lack of foresight, but more about the potential downsides of listening too closely to, existing customers.
Yeah, it's an intriguing idea, isn't it? He does a brilliant job of showing how focusing too much on customer satisfaction, which is obviously important, can actually make a company less able to see and adapt to disruptive technologies.
Absolutely. Before we unpack the dilemma itself, could you give us a bit of background on Clayton Christensen, the man behind the theory? Like, who was he beyond the book?
Well, he brought a very unique perspective to the table. He wasn't just an academic. He was deeply involved in both the business world and the academic world. You see, as a businessman himself, a Harvard Business School professor and a consultant, he had this broad view of the challenges that companies face. So he was able to look at innovation from all these different angles, from the boardroom to the classroom, if you will.
So he was really in the trenches experiencing these challenges firsthand.
Precisely. And that's what makes the innovator's dilemma so powerful. It's not just theoretical. It's rooted in his real-world observations of companies, market trends, and the impact of technology.
Okay, so there was a definite purpose behind this book.
Mm-hmm.
What was Christensen hoping to achieve?
Well, he saw this pattern of well-managed companies struggling with new technologies, and he really wanted to understand why. His goal was to kind of decode this phenomenon. He called it disruptive innovation, and then provide a framework for, not just surviving, but actually thriving in the face of those disruptions.
So a guide to help companies navigate these technological shifts.
Exactly. He lays out a roadmap for recognizing these often subtle signs of disruptive technologies and how to make strategic decisions to stay ahead of the game.
Before we delve into the book chapter by chapter, can you give us a general overview of Christensen's approach? Like, how does he build his argument?
So he uses a very structured approach, focusing on the history of the disk drive industry as his primary case study.
Disk drives, huh? That's an interesting choice.
It is, but it makes sense when you think about it. The disk drive industry, with its constant innovation and shifting leadership, is like a microcosm of the innovator's dilemma in action.
So by looking at disk drives, he's able to draw out these broader principles that apply to other businesses.
Exactly. It's a very clever way to illustrate these patterns of disruption and innovation in a way that's easy to grasp.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Let's jump into the specifics, starting with Chapter 1, a historical perspective. What's the core concept he introduces here?
This chapter lays the groundwork by introducing this fundamental difference between sustaining and disruptive technologies. He says that established companies are really good at sustaining innovations, meaning they're great at constantly improving their existing products to meet the demands of their current customers. They invest heavily in R&D, listen to customer feedback, and just keep making their products better, faster, and cheaper.
Right, that makes sense. Seems like a core principle of good business.
It is. But here's where it gets interesting. Christensen argues that this very focus on sustaining innovations can actually blind companies to the emergence of disruptive technologies.
How so?
While these disruptive technologies often pop up in unexpected corners of the market, they might not initially be as good as the established products. And because they don't meet the needs of those mainstream customers, established companies often dismiss them.
Got it. Can you give us an example from the disk drive industry?
Sure. Take the transition from 14-inch to 8-inch disk drives. The big players were all about improving their 14-inch drives because that's what their main customers, the mainframe computer makers, wanted. Bigger, faster, more powerful. The 8-inch drives just seemed insignificant.
It didn't fit the mold.
Exactly. And the established companies missed this crucial point. These 8-inch drives were perfect for a new market that was emerging, the mini computer manufacturers.
Ah, so a whole new set of customers with different needs.
Exactly. This new breed of manufacturer didn't need those massive 14-inch drives. They needed something smaller, more affordable, and the 8-inch drives were it.
And that's where the disruptors came in.
Exactly. These new companies, with no legacy customers or processes holding them back, they jumped on this opportunity. They really championed the 8-inch format, and, eventually they displaced those giant established companies.
It's kind of a cautionary tale, isn't it? You're so focused on what's worked in the past that you miss what could be the future.
It is. Now, in Chapter 2, Value Networks and the Impetus to Innovate, Christensen dives into this concept of value networks and how they shape a company's perception of, what's valuable and what's not. He says that companies operate within these webs of suppliers, customers, competitors, and these networks have a huge influence on what a company thinks is worth investing in.
It's like you're defined by the company you keep, right?
For sure.
Your network shapes your worldview.
Exactly. A good example is, again, the evolution of disk drive sizes. The 14-inch, 8-inch, and later the 5.25-inch. Each of these represented a different value network. Companies operating in, say, the 14-inch network had completely different costs, profits, customer relationships compared to those in the 8-inch network.
They're playing by different rules.
Right. So established firms, they're deeply entrenched in their current value network. Their whole structure is geared towards serving those existing customers within that system. It makes it really hard for them to see the potential of something new, something that might emerge in a different value network.
Because it just doesn't compute. It's outside their frame of reference.
Exactly. Their past success can actually become a liability. Moving on to Chapter 3, Disruptive Technological Change in the Mechanical Excavator Industry. Christensen takes us out of the world of disk drives for a bit to show how this dilemma isn't limited to the tech industry.
It's a universal challenge. So what's the connection he makes between disk drives and excavators?
He shows how the shift from cable-actuated to hydraulic excavators follows the same pattern. The established companies, just like with the 14-inch disk drives, were focused on making bigger, more powerful cable excavators because that's what their customers and, say, heavy construction wanted.
And then along came hydraulic excavators.
Right. And at first, these hydraulic excavators were seen as inferior. They were smaller, not as powerful.
But they found their niche.
They did. They were perfect for things like residential construction or landscaping, where you didn't need brute strength, but you needed more maneuverability, smaller size.
It's like history repeating itself.
It is. And those hydraulic excavator manufacturers, they got good, really good, serving those new markets. And eventually, they started competing with the big players in their own territory.
Fascinating. It really shows how disruption can come from anywhere. Now, Chapter 4, what goes up can't go down. This one looks at why it's so hard for established companies to, go down market and embrace these technologies that pop up in those seemingly less profitable segments.
Christensen argues that it's not simply about, being able to make the technology. It's about the whole structure of the company, the financial incentives, the way they're organized. It all pushes them towards those higher margin markets.
So why is up seen as the natural direction? What makes down so difficult?
Well, think about it. Companies, especially publicly traded ones, are under constant pressure to grow profits. So their resources, their investments, their whole reward system is geared toward bigger market share, higher margins. Moving up market fits into that. Bigger deals, more profits.
That makes sense. But then what makes going down market such a challenge?
Because these disruptive technologies, they often start in markets that are smaller, less predictable, and yeah, less profitable, at least at the beginning. They might even take away from a company's existing products. So it's tough to justify focusing on that when you've got those seemingly safer, more lucrative options upmarket.
So it's like this balancing act. Do you go for the quick win, knowing it might hurt you long term, or do you embrace the unknown, which could be a problem right now?
That's the innovator's dilemma in a nutshell.
It's a tough spot to be in. So in Chapter 5, Disruptive Technologies, Catching the Wave, I'm guessing Christensen offers some advice on how companies can navigate this.
He does. He proposes a pretty bold solution, spinning out independent organizations to go after those disruptive opportunities. The idea is to create a separate entity free from the baggage and the mindset of the parent company.
Give it space to breathe.
Yeah, this new entity, it can operate with a clean slate, different costs, different structures, a different way of thinking.
Can you give us an example of a successful spin-out and maybe one that, well, didn't go so well?
A success story would be Kresge's Kmart. Kres was a traditional retailer, but they saw the potential of discount retailing. So they launched Kmart as a separate entity, which allowed Kmart to have a completely different cost structure, target a different customer, and really thrive.
Smart move. What about one that didn't work out?
Woolworth's Woolco is a good example of what not to do. They tried to compete in the discount market, but they tried to integrate it into their existing operations. Woolco was stuck with the same overhead, the same management, same profit expectations as Woolworth's core business. And it just didn't work.
Because they couldn't adapt.
Right. They were too tied to the old way of doing things.
Okay, Chapter 6, Good Companies, Bad Investments. This one sounds interesting. If disruptive technologies are so great, why do good companies make decisions that, well, prevent them from adopting these technologies?
It's not that they're intentionally making bad decisions. It's that their whole system, the way they decide where to put their resources, it's all designed for those sustaining innovations, not disruptive ones.
Can you explain that a bit more? How do their own processes work against them?
So remember those value networks. Well-established companies are really good at evaluating investments within their current network. They have all these sophisticated tools, financial models, ways of making decisions, and it's all geared toward maximizing profits in their existing markets.
So they're good at playing the game they know, but not so much at seeing the new game that's starting up.
Exactly. Those disruptive technologies, they often emerge in markets that are too small or too unpredictable to even register on their radar. The data's messy, the potential profits are unclear, and it just doesn't make sense for them to focus on that when they've got these established, predictable markets.
So it's not that they're making bad choices, it's just that their systems are set up to overlook those opportunities.
Right. Their processes are designed for today, not for some uncertain future. And that leads us to Chapter 7, Discovering New and Emerging Markets. Christensen acknowledges how hard it is to actually identify these markets for disruptive technologies. Traditional market research just doesn't work very well.
Because you're trying to predict the future, essentially.
Right. He emphasizes the importance of experimentation, trial and error, being willing to adapt. It's about exploring and adjusting as you go.
Got it. Is there an example from the book that illustrates this?
Yeah, he talks about Hewlett-Packard's Kitty Hawk disk drive. HP was a leader in the disk drive industry, and they had their sights set on the emerging market for personal digital assistants, PDAs. They did their market research, talked to potential customers, designed what they thought was the perfect product.
Sounds like they did everything right.
They did, based on what they knew at the time. But the PDA market didn't develop the way they expected, and the demand just wasn't there. They made a big investment based on assumptions that turned out to be wrong.
So what's the lesson there?
When you're dealing with these disruptive technologies, new markets, you have to be flexible. You can't be afraid to admit you don't have all the answers.
Makes sense. It's about being agile, not rigid.
Exactly. Okay, Chapter 8, Managing Disruptive Technological Change, a Capabilities Perspective. This is where Christensen offers a framework for understanding why some organizations are just better at handling certain types of innovation than others.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell us more.
He says that a company's capabilities are shaped by three things: its resources, its processes, and its values.
Okay, let's break that down. Resources, that's pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah, resources are the tangible stuff. People, equipment, money, brand recognition, the assets a company uses.
Got it. What about processes?
Processes are how the company does things, the routines, the procedures, how decisions are made.
And values.
Values are the heart of the company, the beliefs, the priorities, the things they really care about.
So how do these three things, resources, processes, values, how do they impact innovation?
Well, Christensen argues that different types of innovation require different capabilities. Sustaining innovations, those improvements we talked about, those often work within a company's existing structure. They use the resources, processes, and values they already have. They fit.
But disruptive innovations, not so much.
Right. They often need new processes, maybe even a shift in values, and sometimes even new resources. They shake things up.
So to handle those disruptive innovations, companies need to be willing to adapt, to change their processes, maybe even their values.
Exactly. It takes a willingness to evolve.
Really interesting. Now, Chapter 9, Performance over Supply and the Disruption of Established Value Networks. What's performance over supply?
This chapter is about how technology sometimes improves faster than the market demands. Products become, well, too good. They offer more than most customers need or even want.
Interesting. Any real-world examples of this?
Sure. Think about computers. The processing power, the memory, the storage capacity, they've all grown massively. But for the average person, they don't need all that power. It's overkill.
Okay, so how does this performance over supply tie into disruptive innovation?
It creates an opening for disruptors. See, while those new technologies might not be as powerful as the existing ones, they might offer something else. Lower cost, or they're simpler, or maybe they're just more convenient.
Can you give us a concrete example?
The rise of mini-mills in the steel industry is a good one. The big integrated steel mills, they were focused on producing high-grade steel, and in doing so, they accidentally created this opening for mini-mills, which used a simpler process to make lower-grade steel, but it was cheaper.
And that lower-grade steel, it was good enough for some purposes.
Yes. Mini-mills targeted markets that didn't need the highest quality steel, like construction. They used that performance oversupply at the high end to create a whole new market based on affordability.
So it's like by focusing on the high end, you leave yourself vulnerable at the low end.
Exactly. Now, in Chapter 10, Creating New Market Space, a case study. I'm assuming Christensen puts all this into practice.
He does. He uses the electric vehicle market as a case study to illustrate these principles of disruptive innovation.
Is he saying that electric vehicles are a disruptive technology?
Yes. They came onto the scene with limitations compared to gas-powered cars, limited range, took longer to refuel, higher upfront cost.
But they also offered some advantages.
Right. Better for the environment, quieter.
So how should companies approach this, according to Christensen?
It's about finding the right fit. Don't try to force electric vehicles into a market where they're not quite ready. Instead, focus on those areas where their strengths are most valuable, like urban deliveries, short commutes, places where range isn't as much of an issue.
Find the right problem for the solution.
Exactly. And finally, Chapter 11, the asymmetric motivation of entrants and incumbents. This is a really interesting one. He talks about how those new players, those entrants, often have an advantage when it comes to disruptive innovation. Really? You'd think the big companies would have the upper hand.
You would, but it's because those new players, they're not burdened by legacy. They can be more agile, take more risks, target new markets without worrying about cannibalizing their existing business.
They're playing a different game.
Exactly. They've got nothing to lose and everything to gain. Their lack of legacy is their strength.
Yeah.
Yeah, so as I was saying, they're not weighed down by, years of doing things a certain way.
Makes sense. So they can be bolder, take those risks that established companies might shy away from.
Exactly. They have less to lose and potentially, well, everything to gain. And that lack of legacy, it actually becomes their strength. It lets them move quickly, adapt, and really capitalize on those emerging opportunities.
It's like the classic David and Goliath story. Being the underdog becomes a real advantage. We've covered a lot, but of course, no book is without its critics. What are some of the counter-arguments to Christensen's Innovator's Dilemma?
The Innovator's Dilemma has been hugely influential, but it has sparked debate, definitely. Some critics say that it focuses so much on these large, established companies that the framework might not apply as well to smaller companies or startups.
That's an interesting point. So does size really matter when it comes to this whole disruptive innovation thing?
While the specific challenges and opportunities might be different depending on a company's size, I think the fundamental principles of disruptive innovation, those still hold true. Even startups, as they grow and become successful, they can become vulnerable to disruption from, newer, even more nimble competitors.
So it's less about size, more about mindset, that ability to adapt.
Exactly. A company's ability to adapt, to embrace change, that's what really matters in the long run, regardless of how big they are.
Makes sense. Now, what about the criticism that focusing too much on disruptive technologies might actually stifle the other kind of innovation, the incremental kind?
It's a valid point. While Christensen emphasizes disruptive innovation, he doesn't completely discount the value of sustaining innovations, those incremental improvements. He acknowledges that constantly making your existing products and services better, that's still crucial.
So it's not an either-or situation.
Right. Companies need to find that balance. Invest in those incremental improvements while also actively exploring those new technologies, those new markets that could be disruptive.
It's about playing the short game and the long game at the same time.
Yes, exactly.
This goes back to that key distinction between sustaining and disruptive technologies. Could you elaborate on the defining characteristics of each?
So, sustaining technologies, they're all about improving existing products in ways that mainstream customers already value, making a good product even better, faster, cheaper, more efficient.
And disruptive technologies, well, they disrupt.
Right. Disruptive technologies often introduce a different set of attributes, things that might not initially appeal to those mainstream customers. They might not be as good by those traditional measures, but they offer other advantages, like being cheaper, being simpler to use, more convenient.
So they cater to a different kind of customer, one with different priorities.
Exactly. And these technologies, they often pop up in these niche markets, those underserved segments that the big players haven't really noticed. They might not seem like much at first, but that's where the opportunity lies.
It's like finding a diamond in the rough. It might not look like much initially, but with some polishing, it could be something special.
I like that analogy. And as those disruptive technologies improve, they often end up meeting the needs of those mainstream customers, but at a lower cost, maybe with more convenience. And that's when those established players, the ones who ignored them early on, that's when they start to sweat.
Because by then, it might be too late.
Exactly. It can be really hard to catch up once that disruption gains momentum.
It's a bit like, if you're not moving forward, you're falling behind.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, so let's say a company recognizes a potential disruptive technology. What then? How do they manage it? What does Christensen suggest?
Well, one approach we touched on earlier is that spinning out a separate organization. Give that new venture the freedom to operate outside the existing structures and processes.
Let it grow without being held back.
Exactly. Another strategy is acquiring a smaller company that's already operating in that disruptive space.
So buy your way in, essentially.
In a way, yes. It's a way to get the expertise, the technology, those customer relationships without having to start from scratch. Of course, it comes with its own challenges. Integrating a smaller company into a larger one, it can be tricky.
Yeah.
But it can be a faster path to market.
So it's a trade-off. Speed versus those integration challenges.
Right.
Now, what about those companies that want to, or maybe try to, develop these disruptive technologies internally?
It's definitely possible, but it takes a real commitment to creating an environment where that kind of innovation can flourish. Even if it clashes with the company's existing culture, the way they do things.
It's like trying to grow a delicate plant. You need just the right conditions.
That's a great way to put it. Those companies need to create that protected space, that internal incubator, to shield that disruptive project from all the pressures of the core business.
Which can't be easy. How do you manage expectations when you've got something so potentially transformative happening within an organization that's already successful?
It's a real balancing act. You have to protect that disruptive project, but also manage the expectations of everyone who's invested in the existing business.
So it's tightrope walk, for sure. We've talked about the challenges, some strategies. But what about the potential rewards? Why should companies even bother with all of this?
Because the potential payoff is huge. It's not just about surviving, it's about thriving. It's about unlocking new growth, creating a future for the company that's sustainable.
Can you give us some specifics? What are the benefits?
Disruptive innovation can open up whole new markets, create new revenue streams, really revitalize a company's growth, especially if their core business is starting to stagnate or face more competition.
It's about getting ahead of the curve, not just staying on it.
Yes. It's about recognizing that what got you to this point might not be enough to take you to the next level. The companies that really succeed, they're the ones that are willing to adapt, to evolve, even to reinvent themselves.
Can you give us some real-world examples of companies that have successfully navigated this disruptive landscape.
Oh, absolutely. There are so many great examples across industries. Take Amazon, for instance. They disrupted the entire retail industry by starting with a simple idea, selling books online.
Which, at the time, who would have thought it would revolutionize the way we shop?
Exactly. That's the power of disruptive innovation. It often starts small, but can have this massive impact.
And Amazon, they didn't stop there.
No, not at all. They kept expanding what they offered. They got incredibly good at logistics, and they built this customer-centric culture that's really become the gold standard.
And they just keep innovating, pushing the boundaries. They're a perfect example of a company that's not afraid to disrupt itself.
They are, and that's what sets them apart. They know that to stay ahead, you have to be willing to, in a way, cannibalize your own success.
What other companies come to mind when you think of successful disruptors?
Netflix is a classic example. They completely changed the video rental market, first with the DVDs by mail, then with streaming.
They saw how consumer behavior was changing, and they adapted, even if it meant disrupting their own business.
Exactly. They knew that clinging to the past, even a successful past, wasn't a good long-term strategy.
What about the ride-hailing industry?
Oh, Uber and Lyft, they're prime examples. They took on the established taxi industry by using technology to create a service that was more convenient, more efficient, often cheaper.
And they faced a lot of resistance along the way.
Oh, absolutely. Disruption is rarely easy. There's always pushback from those who benefit from the way things are. But Uber and Lyft, they stuck with it, and they really changed the game.
It's amazing how these companies, they start with what seems like a simple idea, just a way to improve something that already exists, and they end up transforming entire industries.
It is. It speaks to the power of innovation.
These examples really bring the ideas from the innovator's dilemma to life.
They do. They show how real the impact of disruptive innovation can be.
And how important it is for companies to understand these forces, to use Christensen's framework to their advantage.
Yes, because you can either ride that wave or get crushed by it.
That's a great way to put it.
It's not just about seeing those disruptive innovations coming. It's about knowing what to do about them. And that's what Christensen gives us, a way to think about these changes and how to respond.
So as we reflect on the innovator's dilemma, what are some of those key takeaways that really resonate? And how can our listeners take those insights and turn them into something actionable?
Well, I think one of the most powerful messages is the importance of challenging our own assumptions. Christensen really encourages us to question what we think we know about our markets, our customers, even our own strength.
It's about staying curious, right? And humble, remembering that things can change even if we're successful right now.
Exactly. We need to always be learning, adapting, looking for those signs of change.
Because what got us here might not get us there. That's a dangerous trap to fall into, thinking that past success guarantees future success.
It is. And another crucial takeaway is the importance of experimentation. For disruptive innovation to flourish, you need an environment where failure isn't feared, where it's seen as a learning opportunity.
So creating a culture where people feel safe, taking risks, trying new things, even if they don't always pan out.
Exactly. Companies that encourage that kind of experimentation, they're the ones that are more likely to spot those disruptive opportunities and capitalize on them. They're not afraid to try, to fail fast, and learn from it.
It's about being agile, able to adapt, to change course when needed. We've talked a lot about companies, but how about individuals? We're all navigating our own career, so how can individuals apply these principles?
Absolutely. The innovator's dilemma has a lot to offer individuals as well. One key takeaway is the importance of building a unique skill set. Always looking for ways to add value, especially as the world changes.
It's not just about being irreplaceable, it's about being indispensable.
That's a great way to put it. Just like companies need to adapt to those market shifts, individuals need to make sure their skills and expertise stay relevant, in demand.
So being proactive, looking ahead, thinking about what skills might be needed in the future.
Exactly. And another thing for individuals is the importance of networking, building those relationships both within your field and outside of it.
Broadening your horizons, exposing yourself to new ideas, new ways of thinking.
Right. The more diverse your network is, the better equipped you'll be to see those emerging trends, to navigate those disruptions in your own career.
This has been a fascinating conversation. As we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one message you hope our listeners take away from this?
You know, if there's one enduring lesson from the innovator's dilemma, it's that change is going to happen, but disruption doesn't have to be something we fear. By understanding these forces, challenging our own assumptions, embracing experimentation, and always being willing to learn and adapt, we can not only weather those changes, but use them to our advantage to create a future that's more innovative, more fulfilling, both in our work and in our lives.
Beautifully said. And with that, we'll wrap up our deep dive into Clayton Christensen's The Innovator's Dilemma. Thank you all for joining us. Until next time.